Because 15 minutes, that is brave. But if the opening doesn't go Magnus's way, he will regret choosing white. And Hikaru does have enough time. Hikaru has plenty of time by his standards, at least.
You make that bid of 15 minutes, and you're just saying I'm going to crush you.
Well, Magnus also said yesterday that it's good to switch up your bids so you're not predictable when it comes to the next Armageddon. And that said, as you're suggesting, Tanya, he wants the white pieces. He feels confident he can win the game. And the big question is, what will Hikaru play with black? Because in most of his games, he's playing offbeat stuff.
But the line that he chose earlier with pushing his D and C pawn forward, he managed to survive out of the opening and neutralize it really quickly. But Magnus will not let that happen this time. He has to win. Black needs only a draw in the Armageddon. Magnus Carlsen starts with 15 minutes. Hikaru Nakamura starts with result odds. And the games are ready to be underway between the world's best players. And now we go.
Handshake and we're off. Magnus Carlsen, he starts with the king's pawn instead, so veering away from that double queen's gambit. And we see Nakamura employ the Petrov defense. Solid stuff. And it, again, the Damiano variation that we saw yesterday, he employed this with success. What do you think, Robert?
It's one of these decisions where either Magnus looked at Hikaru's games because he played this yesterday, or he didn't look at it because it's so ridiculous that he would play this at the highest level. And Hikaru, well, what risk does he have right now? That being said, it's an equal position on move 4, move 5. Who cares? It's Magnus Carlsen. He's proven time and time again he can somehow squeeze water out of a stone. Will he be able to in this Armageddon game? That's the big question.
Yeah, and interesting that Magnus doesn't go for any forcing lines, any direct lines. We saw complicated battles in this variation yesterday. Magnus says, my approach in this Armageddon is to slowly outplay you later and maybe hustle you on the clock. It's very strategic, very slow right now. Actually, this is a well-known position with colors reversed, and it's odd to see the white knight stay on e5 in the Petrov defense. Looks like Nakamura's prepared, though, playing super quick up to this point, only spending a few seconds. Magnus brings his bishop out. Slight advantage because he has that centralized knight. He has the first move in these types of symmetrical positions.
And it is about fighting that knight on e5 with your own pieces as black here, expecting Hikaru to line up his rook on the e file, develop his own knight to c6, try to trade off that very strong piece that is posted on e5. The task is clear for both these players. Magnus has no choice but to keep the game going. He has to try and keep as many pieces on the board, but one set of minor pieces will come off in the center of the board.
That's very likely, but it's hard to know when to capture it, because if black captures that knight on e5 at some moment, a pawn will replace the knight, and then there will be attacking chances for white, namely with that bishop on d3. So I think Magnus, he needs to play a little bit quickly here. Hikaru, with 9 minutes remaining on his clock, I think he's off to the best start imaginable.
Yeah, Hikaru will be thrilled. He might not look it. I'm not sure what face number that is of Hikaru's right now.
345.
Oh, Danny might tell you off for that one. But shielding the glare of Magnus, but he's solid, and that's all he can ask for.
Solid is the name of the game right now with the Petrov defense. Rook has lined up. We are expecting a knight development. And meanwhile, Magnus takes his time, but he's got to be careful because he has to keep the pressure on the clock as well. If the clocks level out, then it's just result odds for white. And Hikaru does not develop the knight, but strikes immediately in the center, targeting the main defense of that e5 knight.
Huge decision, though, because if Magnus just captures the pawn that was placed on c5, there will be an isolated queen pawn for Hikaru. That's not a bad thing necessarily, but when you don't have so much time, I think players tend to struggle protecting that pawn. You operate around it, that's true, but defending it, that's a different story.
Yeah, big decision, as you mentioned, Robert, to change the pawn structure. I just don't know whether Hikaru's playing for the result or... Sorry, I'll let you take it away there.
You're absolutely right here. c5 is a very committal move by Hikaru, and we will come back to this and see what Magnus decides. How does he respond to these questions being asked at the center of the board? Remember, it's all about the fight for that e5 post. Meanwhile, action is heating up on the other Armageddons as well, and big fights all around right now. Magnus really taking his time. 12 minutes on the clock. And we will come back to this, but let's jump over to Wesley So and Alireza Firouzja. That One, I am expecting not to be such a strategic. And what expression number was that?
Oh, look at the position. Hikaru is losing as we tune in because of the weak dark squares around his king. You see the board on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. A rook trade just happened, and Hikaru, his dark squares, he doesn't have a Fianchetto bishop over there. The bishop for white just going one square forward in the diagonal. I think the black king's just getting checkmated.
Yeah, and Hikaru, he did such a good job on the clock, but unfortunately one slip just as we joined the game. And there we go, Robert, you mentioned it, the white bishop landing on e5, and black's knight simply stuck. It cannot cover enough squares. G7 is a potential checkmate square, the corner square on H8, all the dark squares potential landing spots for the white queen, and it's sneaking in. No way to stop it now. How is he going to try and cling on? He drops the knight all the way back, but there we go, the queen's coming in. Ooh, he's allowing some checks.
At the very least, white can grab the a7 pawn because the bishop on e5 dominates the knight. There are no moves without giving a check. And if white can force the queens and the knight off the board, it's a winning king and pawn endgame. But be careful in positions like this because just trading the queens, if those disappeared, maybe black would have some chances because white doesn't have the easiest path towards a passed pawn.
Still some work to do.
He doesn't trade off immediately, and my question was going to be, if he did take bishop takes knight, were there some threats of perhaps landing into a perpetual? But Magnus doesn't even want to calculate that. That bishop on e5 is dominating. The pawn on f3 dominates that knight on f6, and it's Magnus's pieces that are playing all over. He's up a pawn, but at some point you have to start making progress. He sidesteps any checks, and now he's threatening to grab that knight and perhaps go into a winning king-pawn endgame.
Definitely. He wants to transition. He wants to transform his advantage, make things easier, simplify the equation. Also, that white king can start walking its way forward now on the dark squares. Black is just really stuck. Hikaru needs to avoid this trade, bishop for knight. But if he drops his knight back, still no threats, nothing to do. He's stuck. And look at the clock suddenly, under 20 seconds. Increment is still a distant dream. It only kicks in at move 60. It's physically going to be impossible, surely. 14 seconds left.
And here's the big question, and you could see that Magnus is thinking about, can I take this knight on f6? And if the queen takes out, can I then put my queen on e5 with check and trade queens? Now, sometimes you try to liquidate too soon, and it's actually the black king that will march quickly up the board and start stealing some of white's pawns. So it's a big moment here for Magnus Carlsen. I do not think he should take the knight and trade queens. That could easily backfire as black will shut down the protection of that pawn and go and win it.
Moral, ethical decision here. Do you just try and play quick moves, flag the opponent, or do you actually slow down and try to find objectively the best moves? Because 12 seconds for Nakamura, physically so tough. And queen's off the board now.
Queen's up the board. Hikaru needs only a draw somehow, but he needs a big miracle right now to convert this into a draw. At least he can feel safe that he's not getting checkmated anytime soon.
But he's going to lose his rook pawn. That's on a dark square. Only one side is a dark square bishop. And here it goes. Magnus breaks that little pawn chain there, steals the rook pawn. So now he'll have passed pawns on opposite sides of the board. That's going to be too much for the black's pieces to deal with.
And 4 seconds for Hikaru. He has to make a move. Whoa.
Magnus is playing surprisingly slowly, but Hikaru...
See, look at that speed.
He's trying to pre-move, but he's running out of time.
There's no mouse.
There's no mouse, and okay, Hikaru resigns.
Handshakes, and Magnus Carlsen does it, takes it in the Armageddon. Wow, some fantastic technique there by Magnus. And big news coming in. Denis Lazovic takes his Armageddon.